Hello, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the 2022 Sophos Security SOS Week. Today's topic is the art of detection, finding needles in haystacks, and I am joined by Greg Rosenberg, who comes from Sophos in the US, and he is a director of sales engineering at Sophos. Welcome, Greg. Let's start, as I did yesterday with Fraser, talking about what it is. And Fraser made a point that in the old days, when malware arrived, it was typically evil.exe. And it might be terribly complicated, much more complicated than today's malware. But once you got it, you could take it apart and then you knew everything about it because it was always the same every time. The behavior was the same. It's absolutely not like that anymore, is it? It's detection is about finding all sorts of things, even things that are supposed to happen. So you can make sure that they did occur, as well as finding the things that aren't supposed to be there.
That's right. And thanks for having me, Doug. I think what we are working under as a community is the assumption that most attacks are spray and pray, right? A piece of malware explodes on an endpoint or a server, and it just landed there immediately. What we're dealing with today are multi-stage complicated attacks, in many cases that leverage existing tool sets within victim organizations, whether it be scripting utilities like PowerShell, remote desktop protocol, or its companion applications, WMI. And so when an adversary is targeting an organization, or at least gets a foothold, there are a whole series of steps that have to take place. And the payload itself, the malware or the ransomware, is really the last step in that process. So the ability to identify the root cause really hinges on the ability to not just deconstruct the malware, but to trace the steps all the way back to the initial access.
Yes, yesterday with Fraser, we spoke about lol bins, living off the land binaries, sort of jargon longhand for programs that are supposed to be there, that can be used for good, often are used for good, but could be used for bad if the crooks get hold of them. And you mentioned PowerShell, and of course, WMI, that's what Windows Management Interface. It's supposed to be there. It's supposed to be part of the management toolkit for Windows itself. So it's not as though you could just turn it off or say, oh, well, whenever we get any report about anything that it's done, we will panic. You have to have a much more nuanced understanding of what's supposed to happen in your network.
That's right. So the prevalence of the tools speaks to their power and their usability. And it's unrealistic to think that we can simply shut those tools off en masse, whether it be something as simple as a startup script for your end users or other companion tools that custom applications require to function today. And so the question then becomes, if I'm looking at a PowerShell script, how do I determine what's legitimate activity versus illegitimate activity? It's not simply a function of saying, oh, I recognize this script. It's nuance in looking at all the variables and the context behind the script itself.
Because I imagine this whole lol bin idea, it doesn't just refer to PowerShell itself. It could be the crooks use PowerShell, but the script they feed to PowerShell is one that they themselves may already have had on their network for some system management tool that the crooks want to use simply for unauthorized system management or system mismanagement, if to think of it another way.
Yeah, and when we think of defense evasion, right, the ability to fly underneath the radar, when we think about these different needles, you have to understand that, a traditional malicious binary or executable file, is very much a binary decision in the past, right? It was, is this good or is this bad? And people kind of think about this in terms of a signature base. And what the adversaries realized was they could tweak bits at a very granular level so that you couldn't have an exact match. And that was really what drove a lot of the machine learning that we see here today, especially for executable files, to say, how similar does this executable file look to recent malicious files that are out there? We have to extend that conversation to even scripting utilities today to say, is this activity, even with a number of variables, malicious in nature? And the goal of machine learning is not to convict. It's not a binary decision. It's really a spectrum of confidence, right? This is where suspicion is really critical. And I think the key point that you're driving at, and that is, I can say that I'm 50% confident that something is malicious using machine learning models. I can say that I'm 70% confident, but I can't do it in the context of completely making that decision in an automated fashion. The trade-off is always false positives. Like if I crank that dial all the way up, where a lot of vendors say, nothing's going to get past us. What they're really saying is they're adjusting machine learning model to convict almost everything, but it means that the business won't be able to function, right? It means that they're also going to convict a lot of benign scripts and behaviors that run in the environment. And so what's really going on underneath the hood is that we're leveraging ML models to at least prioritize based on confidence to then drop these detections into an analyst's lap to make a final determination.
And I guess it's important also to know sometimes not so much that you've had malware, but that the proactive security related things that you intended to do, such as closing down this account, stopping this process, starting that security service, actually happen. So sometimes the logs aren't just there to tell you that something happened that shouldn't have. They're there to help you confirm that the train is kind of still on the right track, as it were.
That's right. So even if you've got a script, let's say a human is analyzing a PowerShell script that has run, and they're looking at some basic variables to deploy across a series of endpoints. In their mind, it's not just a function of seeing a bunch of malicious behavior that is obvious. What they're also looking for are other examples where the script has run successfully in a way that is predictable with outcomes that are predictable. So you need to understand the context of, the user that is running it, things like the time of day. Hey, it's running at 3 a.m. Is this normal behavior for this particular system? And do I see this in a repeated fashion for a long period of time? So as we kind of make a determination, we're also trying to identify good examples and logs of behavior that we can map against.
So I imagine that in many contemporary malware attacks, ones that may end possibly days, weeks, months later in ransomware, they kind of have to start somewhere. And there's going to be a period, and presumably with care, you can stretch that period as long as possible, during which you might yet have crooks in your network, but you can catch them out before they do the first thing that really counts. In other words, or certainly before they do the last thing that counts. Ideally, you'd get them as early as possible. But there's sort of, although there's no time like the present, it's also important, is it not, to, if you like, know when to raise your awareness rather than just being at high alert all the time. Like you said, you turn all the dials to maximum, convict everything, block everything. Well, you might as well just disconnect your network and turn off all your computers. You probably won't get a ransomware attack, but you probably won't be able to run your business either. And that's quite a balancing act, isn't it?
It is. And I think one of the challenges that I think a lot of organizations face today is understanding that there are a whole series of steps that could move forward and backward multiple times with repeats. But it generally starts with some form of initial access. And what we're commonly seeing and what you see in a lot of the reports that are out there is, someone exposes a port unnecessarily. My admin allowed RDP from the internet, or someone does click a link on an email. That's the initial access. And in fact, there are groups that focus solely on the initial access brokers. But the time from the initial foothold to the time that they deliver the malware, there's a lot of things that happen in between. So
those initial access brokers, they're, if you like, a sort of ecosystem, a niche, a boutique artisan job description, if you like, in the cyber underworld, aren't they? That some of those guys won't be interested in ransomware or even malware. They are happy making their living by finding people's passwords, access tokens, open RDP ports that aren't supposed to be there, and then just packaging them up, putting them up for sale for the next lot of crooks to do whatever they want, possibly even 2 or 3 different lots of crooks if they choose to sell them several times.
That's right. And every organization has value when they're selling them off. I think that's a subtle point that you're making here, is that a lot of organizations think, number one, I'm not going to be targeted. Well, most organizations aren't targeted per se. These are opportunistic in that you've made a mistake. And everyone's going to make a mistake, either via human error, misconfiguration, or a vulnerability that is not patched in time. So when the initial access broker then says, I've got this particular organization, it then becomes a function of, all right, how did you gain access into what system? And who is the actual organization that you've got a foothold in? So what they're really trying to figure out is, number one, is there another group that can carry that specialization further? Oh, I've got a web shell on an Exchange server. Do I need to focus on a particular group that has specialization there? And who is it that I have that foothold with? In other words, what is their capacity to pay if we're talking about malware? Or what is the function of this organization? Maybe they're an energy utility. That's what essentially derives the value of that access that eventually gets sold off.
So those initial access brokers can actually slice and dice the credentials they put up for sale in any number of ways. So somebody might come along saying, well, I specifically want to target company XYZ. And if they can find an access broker who has access credentials for that very company, then that's a strictly targeted attack. Or they might have somebody said, like you said, I'm interested, this week I'm going after the energy industry. Or this week I'm going after attacks that will be based on RDP, not on SSH. So they can slice and dice how they package the credentials they've got for sale and price them accordingly, and presumably sell them more than once.
That's right. It's kind of like the packaging of tools where if I am an adversary, it's hard for me to predict my return on investment with a single organization or even a couple. And so if I'm actually doing some sort of financial modeling, which a lot of these adversaries are doing, I am de-risking this by buying in bundles. In other words, even in an ideal situation, if you grant me that initial foothold, it doesn't mean that I'm going to then deliver a successful attack at the end of the day or at the end of a week or the end of a month, whatever that time period may be, because there is a good chance that some of these victims will pick up on the activity and remediate appropriately. However, there's strength in numbers in these particular scenarios.
Now, we published a report on Sophos News recently. I'm sure you had a hand in that, about a customer who begged us to come in. Their network was, they'd been hit by ransomware. Oh, please come in and help us. And actually, they'd been hit, if I remember correctly, by 3 different attackers. 2 had got in at pretty much the same time without even realizing they were in together. And so the ransomwares kind of overlapped. So some were encrypted with A, then B, some with B, then A. And then while they were trying to fix all that, because they weren't able to do it quickly, I guess they hadn't kind of practiced beforehand, a 3rd lot of attackers got in and encrypted all the doubly encrypted files a 3rd time. So they were it was like they were staring down the barrels of a triple-barreled shotgun, as it were.
It presents an interesting conundrum.
We shouldn't smile and laugh, but it's a terrifying truth.
It is, and I don't mean to make light of it. It's more that, I try to view this from 2 perspectives. For most victims that experience some form of attack, I am very empathetic because I think a lot of organizations lack resources to deal with threats today, especially just warm bodies that can staff 24/7. But on the flip side, it's also interesting to understand that this actually tells you that a lot of threat groups are opportunistic very quickly, right? I think that's one of the lessons that we learned in this particular case was that the access was exposed and they were able to find this, but not just group one, but group two and group three were able to find it. And I think they made a determination that the victim was very valuable. They just didn't communicate with one another what was going on. It made the response, I think, more challenging because of the odd behavior, seeing the file extension change as an example as you're in the course of an investigation. So I think the message is that it's not just one group that's going to target you. It's really a decentralized set of threat actors with different sets of specialties, but they may still coalesce around a single or a group of victims based on their profile.
And my understanding is that not always, but in many cases of ransomware attack, those attacks, they get the news. They're always in the media because they're dramatic. The ransoms often start at several $1 million if you're a big company. So understandably, they're the thing that everyone's afraid of. But it's almost as though if they hadn't done the ransomware, they'd still be in the network. In other words, they only do the ransomware once they've exhausted all the other money that they can squeeze out of your network by stealing passwords, taking screenshots, getting your banking credentials, finding your Amazon access tokens, etc. And in many cases, I believe that the jargon term is dwell time, although they're not really dwelling, they're living life to the full. The crooks could have been in the network not just for days or weeks, but even months.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks to this marketplace for victim organizations where they could be passing access off to a secondary or a tertiary group. So part of it is based on, who the victim is. The second part is they may not have enough tooling to fully exploit the victim environment. They could be waiting for a further vulnerability that, for example, allows them to privilege escalate where they can't do it today. But it doesn't mean they're going to just dump their access or close off their reverse shell. I still want to preserve this because it could have value for me at some point down the road. And then the other thing is that it's a legitimate form of defense evasion to carry out the attack in a slow fashion under certain circumstances, because some tooling is based off of activity over a set period of time.
And I imagine that in many cases, what would have been seen as the beginning, middle, and end of an attack and of your complete detection, remediation, and completion sign off, pat self on back, in the old days, 10 years ago perhaps, would have been, oh look, there's been a malware attack on our computer. It's a good job we got it, otherwise it would have appeared on all the others. But these days, that's not necessarily the case. That could be a deliberate exercise by the crooks to learn more about how your defenses work, do something that doesn't really matter. They don't actually care whether it succeeds or fails. They just want to measure what happens when they do it. You're like tripping the burglar alarm tapping your car once to see if the burglar alarm goes off. The break-in's coming much later.
And, I'll even add on to that we see some other related behaviors that are interesting, if not scary. But they also speak to the fact that not every adversary knows every protection product that's out there. So we've even seen adversaries that have gained access to an environment and then leverage that access to gain administrative control to the web UI for their endpoint protection. But here's the interesting thing, and it's a little bit amusing. They started turning off protections for one of these that I'm thinking of in a certain case. They turned off machine learning and they also turned off some behavioral detections. But they didn't realize until a couple of weeks later that if they just turned off tamper protection, they could globally disable the endpoints and not worry about the individual protection features. So they are also doing that to discover what products you may have underneath the hood as well.
And so they're not necessarily just steaming in and going, oh, I see you've got XYZ anti-malware software, I'm going to kill it off, because you're more likely to notice that. Presumably, as they try and learn from more and more attacks, they also learn A, patience, B, subtlety, which makes that detecting and logging and interpreting what's already happened and what's happening now, it makes it even more important to try and understand or infer what that might imply for the future, even though you can never be absolutely sure.
That's right. So it's not just in the context of the individual victim where they're present. It's also, how do I leverage this information for the second or the third attack that I'm going to partake in? So they'll even do things like test samples in a demo or a lab environment. We've seen them actually stand up systems outside the victim organization because they had access to the tooling itself. So maybe they didn't want to go on the open market and make a license purchase. So this is a mechanism for them to help themselves further on down the road.
And my understanding is that some crooks will even do things like work out, if you use virtualization, they'll actually research what virtualization tools you use. I'm not name any names because don't want to diss any individual. Let's call it ABC virtualizer, and they'll then use those tools to create a virtual machine that they can run or test their malware in, or from which they can launch an attack on your network. In other words, that's sort of what you might call lolbin taken to the extreme. It's not just a binary or a program that they're borrowing. They're borrowing, if you like, almost part of your organizational culture.
Right. And so I think it speaks to a couple of challenges that a lot of organizations face. Number one, having a CMDB or an asset inventory and knowing definitively everything that is legitimate in the environment is probably a challenge for the vast majority of those folks that are out there that are supposed to do that, whether or not you have a good domain infrastructure listing or not. I think the second thing that it speaks to is another challenge, which is a lot of organizations don't really have a great way to deploy agents on new systems that pop up, either done with or without authorization. And so what adversaries in these cases are exploiting is that because you can't track those things and actually get agents installed, endpoint protection or server protection or other security tools, they know that a lot of that behavior will look legitimate in a lot of situations.
So that's like the old, I sometimes get stuck in cliches or truisms. And the thing about truisms is they become truisms because they are actually true. It's sort of like that old saying that, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
That's right. And even if you look at, CIS, the framework, they essentially say you have to know your inventory. Easier said than done. There are tools that are out there to accomplish it. But even if you identify an asset that is somewhat unknown that you have to go track down, it still takes a length of time to figure out, especially organizations that do some form of custom development where they're spinning up machines on a regular basis. If I'm an adversary and I know that, where you've got a whole bunch of development servers, it just means that that's probably a vector that I can exploit really quickly.
And my understanding is that today's cyber criminals, at least the I nearly said the better ones, the ones who've learned the lessons of history, if they create new accounts or they create new devices or new servers or new instances of something on your network, they don't just make up random names that stand out like a sore thumb that you're likely to notice, do they? They take the time to sort of learn your naming convention, possibly even download the documents that describe how you give names to new servers or users or accounts, and how you assign privileges, and they try and fit in with the way that you work, so that if you're only taking a casual look at your logs, or you're not really sure what to look for and you're just hoping that the crooks will stick out like a sore thumb, that's not really going to work enough, be enough, and it's not going to work these days.
It's not. And so there's a couple of points that I'll make there. Number one, I think a lot of organizations aren't even looking in most cases, or they don't necessarily have the trigger to create a log for those types of events, or even when those events do take place, because of the voluminous number of accounts, even in small organizations, when you consider not just users, but when you also look at the use of service accounts that will have pretty obscure naming conventions, it's really hard for the lowest level person in your organization to be expected to distinguish what looks to be legitimate from those that are malicious in a lot of cases. So yeah, the documentation, if the documentation exists, it will be leveraged. However, if it's not, then it's also probably a good indicator that those accounts don't get reviewed.
Yes, I think that there's a saying that we've come up with on the Naked Security podcast many times before, which is that you don't want to be in a position that when the ransomware attack's about to happen or afterwards, you discover that the crooks actually had a better network map than you had yourself. But it seems that in many cases, that is what they end up with.
It is. I think a lot of times, when we begin an incident response engagement with Peter McKenzie's team, we're trying to get a feel for all the assets.
He's on tomorrow, and I'm sure he's going to have some real... I don't know why I'm laughing. Some real horror stories to share, I bet.
It's a challenge. We deal with it in a variety of capacities, even when we're talking about providing a firewall for segmentation. Understanding where those assets live and their capabilities, it is helpful to then understand kind of the critical path or pathways that an adversary will take through the environment. There's a lot of tools that are available. Again, we'll try to avoid naming names that allow you to at least map out those resources. And that's essentially what adversaries are leveraging. And the problem becomes when there's some form of internal reconnaissance, how do you distinguish that from malicious or legitimate behavior? So a lot of organizations, even if they could detect it, do I really need to care about ICMP or the use of an off-the-shelf tool to kind of map out tools? Oh, that's probably someone else just...
Or they think, hey, I'm glad to see the sysadmins working so hard and so much overtime. Greg, I'm conscious of the time, so I would like to take this point to ask you to finish up by offering 3 tips for our listeners, 3 things that people who maybe haven't quite started on this journey of contemporary cybersecurity detection and defense. What are the 3 tips that you would expect people that you could give for people to start with? Either things that they should do if they're not doing already, or things that they should not do if they've got into the habit of doing.
So, number 1, I want everyone who does not have an incident response plan to work on developing one. And there's a lot of great public resources available. It doesn't take any sort of work. But I want you to follow a framework and test it regularly. And my litmus test for whether or not an incident response plan is viable is to give it to the lowest level person in your organization who's hopefully the newest, and have them follow through with it when you test it at least once a year. And they should have the authority to contact the most senior person in the organization. Number 2, I want people to be cognizant of cyber liability insurance. So if you have a policy today, be aware that they ask for a lot of security controls in your application. Make sure that you were the person, if you're technical, that was filling it out and that those controls are still in place, because it's a good way to speak to a lot of the risk that we're seeing out there in the world. And also, you want to make sure that you are covered and don't misrepresent anything that's on there. The third point that I would make is that you need to actually audit a lot of the controls that you have in place. I know it sounds boring, but I would much rather advocate for someone who has endpoint protection and actually looks at their policies to make sure they're as strong as possible and the exclusions that they have in place and make sure they still have legitimate reason to have those in place. And just look at your alerts at least once per day. There's a lot of valuable information that's in there that can clue you off, but you can't get that clue unless you look. So those would be the three things I would say that are actionable right now.
Well, indeed, my opinion is that if you are going to collect logs and never look at them, then it's actually much better not to bother collecting them at all. You'll save an awful lot of disk space, and you'll have an awful lot of data that you don't have to worry about, because if you're not going to use it, what's the point? So, right. Greg, I think that's those tips are things that people can. That some of them may require some kind of cultural change, but none of them really involve actual expense. It's not like, oh, rush out and buy something and press the button. It's all a sense of thinking in the organization about how you're going to adapt to the fact that if you don't change with the crooks, they'll be ahead of you, not behind. So with that, everybody, I would like to say thank you so much for listening. Don't forget, we have 2 days to go, day 3 and day 4 of this year's Sophos Security SOS Week. And so it remains for me only to say, until next time, stay secure.